Hello and welcome to Skeleton Songs.
Hello.
It's not very seasonal to talk about skeletons, but I suppose you could put a hat on it or something.
I don't know, Nightmare Before Christmas.
That's true, which we have been thinking of recently because we've been watching the excellent season 5 of Fargo. Highly recommend.
Highly recommend,
Very
although zero spoilers.
Yeah, absolutely none. So this episode, we are not talking about season 5 of Fargo, nor the fact that Don Draper is in it, but we are talking about...
Susanna Clarke.
Wonderful, wonderful person.
And for this we have a certain ML to thank, who wrote in and reminded us that if you're talking about magic and literature, then Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral is a good kicking off point, and both of us are big Susanna Clarke fans. Despite the fact I keep calling her Susanna Harker.
I know she's got a funny name to remember, I don't know why, but I think she might be my favourite living author, and I think Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral might be my favourite book.
So this bloke called Neil who apparently wrote some comic about...
Oh, he doesn't sound very talented or very successful. Who's this Neil chap?
This Neil chap apparently said...
Neil Gorman?
Yeah.
Neil...
Happyman?
What?
Yeah.
Gaiman.
That's the fella. Anyway,
Neil Gaiman.
Apparently,
if you've heard of him,
he's written some books or some films or some comics or revolutionised the British fantasy scene in the 1990s or whatever. And he said when he has a connection, which we'll come back to, but he said when Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral came out that it was the most important or best work of fantasy in England in the last 70 years.
Did he? I didn't know that.
He did, and the thing I was going to say, I have a lot of sympathy for Neil Gaiman. I don't think he needs my sympathy, but I think if you're Neil Gaiman, you say something in a moment of inattention, it probably goes around the world several more times than you intend to. And people said the last 70 years, what about Lord of the Bleeding Rings then? And various other excellent works of fiction. And he, I don't know whether he backtracked or whether he thought about it again, or whether he just clarified what he originally meant, which was that it's the best work of distinctively English fantasy, as opposed to fantasy written in England, and also as opposed to high fantasy that was distinctively English, because obviously Lord of the Rings is distinctively English high fantasy.
Well, that's exactly what she was trying to achieve, and she had Lord of the Rings was particularly an inspiration.
I knew that Lewis was. I didn't know the Rings was as well.
She reread it recently when she was teaching in Bilbao at the time, which inspired her to write a specific English, fable of magic in this country. So she has clearly managed to achieve exactly what she set out to. It's lovely to see the threads coming together. And of course, she was inspired by Neil Gaiman too.
Anyway, anyway,
vital facts.
Lud-in-the-Mist, Hope Mirrlees, I was going to say, is the book that apparently Gaiman was thinking of, which was written in the 1920s. I keep
meaning to read Lud-in-the-Mist. I started it and I couldn't get past the first page.
No, I had.
But my mum loves it.
Yeah, I had a similar problem. We both bounced off it. Let's read it over Christmas.
Deal.
Anyway, so Susanna Clarke, who is she? What's this been and this book and these blokes?
How dare you, sir? She's not a bint. She's a magical, wonderful idea monster. She is a British author who is most famous for Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral. And she also wrote Piranesi, which is a more recent book, which you may have heard of. And she kind of came out of nowhere.
And The Ladies of Grace Adieu.
And The Ladies of Grace Adieu.
Of which more shortly.
Indeed, a collection of short stories. But her two novels are Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral and Piranesi. And she, I think, was writing for about 10 years before she actually got Jonathan Strange published, which was her first novel. So she'd clearly be an active creative writer for ages. But she, I think for a variety of reasons, lack of confidence, lack of connection, the fact that the novel that Jonathan Strange took a hell of a lot of research and piecing together meant that it didn't see the light of day for many, many years, which I think partly is why, when it came out of nowhere, everyone was like, how is this such a fully formed, amazing piece of literature? But for those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, I can't remember if it's Mr Noral and Jonathan Strange or Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral.
The latter.
I think okay, right. So Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral is a very unusual, very long novel, which is a pastiche of Victorian novels, 19th century, I think, specifically. And it draws explicitly on traditions such as Austen and Dickens, among many others. So when you read it, you might be forgiven for initially thinking, is this the book that I was told to read by these people on the podcast? Because it appears to be a Victorian novel. And continue, my friend, because Susanna Clarke weaves, in a way I haven't seen done before, this fantastically believable kind of realist magic amongst real history. So this is set during the Napoleonic Wars in Britain. There are a number of characters that actually existed in history, and of course a great number of characters that she has made up and made magical. And the whole point is that magic coexists with reality as we know it, but then there's also some alternate history sprinkled in as well. So she, I think, is the first person I've seen do this. I'm sure there have been others, and I'm sure people listening to this can think of some books that they've read that are similar, and I would love to hear them, because if you basically baked in a pie everything that I love, it would be Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral.
So some of the threads I think is really unusual in being so committed to the 19th century conceit, and to the point where she intentionally uses variant spellings. So show she spells with an E, or when she has the names of streets she'll call them like shoe-lane. Puzzled, I think she spells with like one Z or something. So it's really just that conceit, and to see the matter-of-fact way in which magic and fairy are incorporated, and the scholarly disquisitions on them that bind in.
Well, I was going to say that one of the big things you'll notice when you read the novel is the footnotes. This is something that is very rare in fiction, although obviously very common in non-fiction. And there are, I think, over 200 footnotes throughout the whole book, all of which closely and coherently detail this entirely fabricated corpus of magical scholarship. And that's one of the major themes through the book, this juxtaposition. She likes her paradox, does Clarke. This juxtaposition between the sort of study of magic and the scholarship of magic and the sort of gentleman's club of magic, all of which is true and real, that isn't made up, but it's all sort of men reading books and having a cigar, versus the sort of wild fairy magic of this sort of mysterious plane that sometimes reaches into England, but usually is kind of outside of the ken of most people and exists on a separate reality in a way.
I thought for years, quite reasonably I think, that Clarke had been an academic. I assumed she'd been a English literature professor or something, because obviously there's considerable scholarship there, and
do you know
she's very focused on detail. I do, but you go for it.
She was editing cookbooks.
And the
for 10 years.
For 10 years while she worked on this book. And I think as soon as I found out she was an editor, it makes a lot more sense. It's always very dangerous, I think, to find out a biographical detail about an author and make too many assumptions, because there's the Borges gag about Kafka creating his own precursors. Once you see an outcome, you tend to draw lines to relate it back to the inputs.
Which we kind of started the episode with mentioning that Neil Gaiman said it was like, or not like, Lord of the Rings, which was explicitly one of the influences. But it's all a circle.
But the footnotes and the attention to detail, because writers and editors are cats and dogs, and I always remember a spoof letter at the beginning of the Penguin Book of Unrespectable Verse, with an angry writer who's done a letter to his editor and said things like, his publisher, and said things like, editors are black cormorants on the tree of life, and I hope the new wheel falls off your Mercedes-Benz. But obviously, like cats and dogs, we keep each other's populations down to manageable levels. And a lot of the finest writers are also editors, because they learn discipline. I mean, some are not, some are dreadful, but then again, most writers are dreadful. So there you go. I've annoyed everyone now.
Happy Christmas,
and to all a happy New Year. But the footnotes, the attention to detail, and the interest in the context. So I was I didn't have time to reread Hope and Strange and All for this show, because it's big. But
did you mention it's gigantic?
It's gigantic. 10 years worth of work. I read it, Grace Adieu, and there's one of the. So that's short stories. One of the short stories in there is about a character called Dr. Simonelli, who. And there was a framing narrative where a Scottish professor of fairy studies, complains about Simonelli and his diaries, and he says he has all the arrogance of his race, by which I mean, of course, the English. And then he complains that Simonelli, had an extraordinary career, but that he put out a different version of his diaries about every 15 years, and there were 4 different versions, and every version was substantially revised from the previous one, so it's very hard to find what was actually in it. But he said, well, this version is from the earliest version of his diaries, so we have some hope that what actually occurred in it might actually bear some relation to what happened in Dr. Simonelli's life. And And so there's this whole bit there about it being unreliable, and of course what that does is it takes a completely fictional story and makes it seem more authentic and reliable than if they hadn't cast any doubt on it to begin with. So yeah, I see the editor in there.
Well, it's funny you mention this, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that if you wanted to read a book that was most like Book of Hours, Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral is that book, because it has the sort of realist magic thing combined with the scholarly unpicking of the lore behind it that has in fiction been this serious study of scholars for generations, and you're kind of picking through this body of work. It has the same vibe to me. Does that?
It does. And I think it is the same vibe for different reasons as well. So here's the thing about Strange and Norrell. When people were enthusing me about it, I didn't read it for years because
Were you being contrary?
No. I mean, partly I think because it was such a gigantic success that I assumed it was probably a bit below brow than it is, because
I'm amazed at it as well as
I'm
it did.
At 4 million copies.
Really?
Yeah, and the thing is, Clark and Greenland, her husband and supporter,
we'll
was
come
a very
back to
talented
them.
writer in his own right, but he said they couldn't believe the level of success. They'd assumed 150 people would read it and absolutely love it.
Well, that's because that had been her previous history, you know this?
Yeah.
That prior to publication, she had been publishing in a number of totally, I've never heard of them.
But stay with me, because I want to do the overlap first, and let's come back to that, because you can talk about Greenland as well. But I didn't read it because the things people were enthusing about, the footnotes about magic and whatnot, were things that I was already doing in my work and proto work at the time. And it's annoying when you're trying to start a creative career on your own to read somebody who's doing it better. It just makes you a bit grumpy about it.
I can see that.
So I think people assumed it was more of an influence than it was on some of my work since. And to be clear, I love it, and I've read Strange and Norrell 2 or 3 times over the years, and I'm sure.
But I've never heard you reference it as a.
No, so it's not a conscious inspiration.
No, I think both of you are just drawing from similar.
So, well, that's the other thing I was going to say is one of the things that keeps coming up when Clark talks about her work. 2 things. First of all, there's lots of references to characters who just really want to stay in and read or stay in and write. Apparently when she went to Italy to sort of try to reboot her life, she wasn't what to do. She thought she'd be having this mad social life and meeting Italian boyfriends, and she just felt what she wanted to do was stay in her room and write. So a lot of her magician characters are like that. And the other thing is the Englishness. The word that keeps coming up when she describes what she intends is grey, which is a very English word. Grey. But often that's the grey beauty of the Yorkshire moors or English skies or rain or mist, which is a glorious but very grey thing. And one of the phrases I saw somebody use about Book of Hours is cosy Anglicanism.
I remember that phrase.
And I think
really
that's really good at putting it.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of sense of, it's almost like Hygge, but the Danes got the word first, being by a fire while the inclement weather is outside, and enjoying what the English weather looks like when you don't have to be in it, is a particularly Strange and Norrell thing, and also happens to be a particularly Hush House thing. But I interrupted you, so talk about what you were saying.
No, I'm thinking about Miss now. I eschew what I was saying before. We've moved on.
You're talking about her career.
So what I was saying earlier about why I think her husband and I think cheerleader and everything else, number one fan, was surprised at her success was not because he didn't have faith in her from everything that I've read about, and we'll come back to their really lovely story shortly. It was that she had found some very modest success writing for some very niche magazines. I think they were called Starlight or something, or maybe they weren't even magazines, maybe they were sort of compendiums of short stories of unheard of fantasy authors. So she was described as having something like 100 people who really loved her stuff, but was otherwise totally unknown. And then mysteriously Jonathan Strange happened, and the whole world was like, where has this woman been? And I still don't understand why a Victorian novel resonated with people so much, because the style, I have a number of friends who studied English at university, so you would have thought they'd have loved it, and a lot of them were put off by it because they just don't like reading Victorian novels because it is such a stylized way of expressing a story.
You understand people better than me. I mean, it's not saying much. But why did you love it so much?
Well, like I said, I think it does feel like it was like personally tailored to everything that I love. I mean, I like classic English literature, so I didn't find it off-putting at all. I've read a lot of Victorian novels, so for me it was like, oh yeah, old friend, hello, except that it was doing some stuff that I'd never seen before in a Victorian novel, because of course it had a modern author and it was talking about magic and lots of interesting things that weren't in actual novels. So that I found very enjoyable because I recognised the tropes but saw what she was doing differently, so that felt satisfying. It was just a fantastic story. Many of the characters, almost all of the characters, are both deeply flawed and deeply attractive or sympathetic. It's, I mean, I could just go on forever. I like the English thing. Part of her inspiration for writing it was she wanted to write a sort of English, not epic, but she wanted to have a sort of real English novel, which she felt that hadn't been written, certainly not in the fantasy setting with magic. So Englishness comes up again and again and what it means, and it isn't a sort of drum-beating imperialist nonsense, and nothing of that. It really gets to the soul of, I think, a lot of what English people think about England. So there is a sense of the kind of Jerusalem rolling green that English people tend to respond to and think we have some pretty great landscapes, which has, you know, spurred a lot of literary movements in the past because it's inspirational and beautiful, but it also has a keen awareness of the class system, which he subverts with the whole Stephen Black subplot, which I won't spoil for you, but that is a very inventive mix of realism with a dash of fantasy. It just touches on a lot of different things very deftly. It subverts the north and south divide. If you don't know anything about England, there is a real issue with the country essentially being divided into the north and south, and traditionally the north has had less money than the south, and the north has often been portrayed in Victorian novels as a quite industrial, quite unpleasant place, or it's been sort of estate of the landed gentry who have, you know, 1,000 acres of rolling green lands and a pond. But that's basically what the north has been presented as, whereas the south is often more presented as a sort of going places, urbanite, London, kind of inspirational place. And in Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral, those two are kind of reversed, and you do get this sense that London is cramped and a bit stressful, and it's, as what you were saying earlier, that maybe there's a sense that everyone wants to stay in and read books and look at the beautiful rain. Well, in London you can't, because everyone's knocking on your door and there's always noise and it's smoky and you have to go out for dinners all the time because society is very important. And it gets in the way, whereas the north is presented as this sort of beautiful retreat, and often melancholy and often quite scary. I mean, there are some bad things that happen in the book. People die, and there are some very frightening experiences, particularly with or on the borders of Faerie and Fairyland. And that tends to happen in the wilds of the north, but it is a very poetic, beautiful, romantic with a capital R north, and the north has more affiliation explicitly with this old magic of John Usglas the Raven King, whereas London has much more affiliation with this new scholarly approach to magic, which is championed by Mr Noral, who is this very clever, very educated man, but that education and brilliance comes at the cost of having, as far as I can tell, no sense of humour whatsoever, and being sort of actually quite controlling and damaging to what he ostensibly cares about. He is objectively a good magician, and he does know everything about magic that can be read from books, but he wants to control it, he doesn't want other people to have it, and he doesn't really think you should ever use it, which is questioned several times by other people as what the point is of knowing everything about a topic that you never use. So yeah, I love it.
so the north-south thing, I'm glad you brought that up.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting, and I think when people think about England, what they think about is London, Wales and Scotland. Now, first of all, of course, Scotland and Wales
you'll be shocked for that
are not in England. But, you know, I remember a friend of mine when I was living abroad ring me up and saying, hello, this is friend's name, calling from Bangor in England. Bangor is in Wales. And again, for the non-UKians, the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland and Great Britain consists of the bit of Ireland that we hung on to and haven't given back, because a lot of people who live there don't want it given back, and it's complicated. And then Great Britain, which is England, Wales and Scotland, and some sort of dangling off islands with slightly peculiar status. But the rest of England tends to be forgotten about because London is the sort of, it's like the most talented child in the family everyone else is a bit cross with.
Yeah.
Because they get all the plaudits and and they're the firstborn. As one of the reasons I set Hush House in, I set Book of Hours in Cornwall. Although, you know, Cornwall is one of the better known bits because it's a touristy bit.
But it shares, I think, the same character of the North, which is, I think it has a sort of feel of genteel neglect, that it is this great place in many ways. It has this romantic nature, but it hasn't been invested in.
And also, it's not the home counties, it's not London, it's not the South East. So a lot of things people assume about England aren't true of it. And what struck me when I was rereading Susanna Clarke is you see people talk about Derbyshire. I can't remember the last time I saw Derbyshire referenced in something that was written to feel English.
Well, Austen does it constantly.
That would make sense.
I think that's an explicit homage, and particularly Derbyshire is a thing in Pride and Prejudice. So I'm sure she loves Derbyshire, but I think it is also a deliberate reference to Austen.
Again, non-UK and English speakers, shires, as you probably know, are equivalent of Canadian provinces or US states. I don't know does Australia have states? I think it does. Anyway. But there's Ladies of Grassadieu.
Tell me about this, because you know much more about this than I do.
Well, so first of all, I think it's worth mentioning that Ladies of Grassadieu was the first strange story, capital S strange, that she ever wrote. It was the piece she wrote for the creative writing class, and I'll let you tell that story, that ultimately led to her success. And it uses one of the same characters from the novel, who ends up in a remote part of England where he comes across three women who, in the time-honoured trope of three women in fantasy short stories, are effectively witches, although I don't think that word is ever used.
No.
And they are very suspicious of Strange, who they refer to as the London magician. And Strange, who thinks what they're doing with magic is unwise, actually loses his temper slightly, which is very unlike him, and he says, I am not the London magician, I'm the Shropshire magician. And Mr Noral is the Yorkshire magician. And I really heard the echo of many people over the years who've said, you know, I'm English, I'm not from London, these are different things, but everyone thinks they're the same.
But this is really interesting you mentioned that, because this actually is a plot point in Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral. I don't know if you remember, one of the big antagonists of the novel is a gentleman called the Gentleman with Thistledown Hair, who has never given a specific name, but turns out, slight spoilers here, so close your ears if you haven't read the book. 1, 2, 3. He turns out to be a fairy, and he's super trouble. And one of the things that goes awry and ultimately affects the end of the novel is he curses Jonathan Strange specifically, but the magic system that Clarke has devised essentially uses natural magic laws, but they have to be wielded with quite a lot of specificity. So he curses the English magician because he doesn't know Jonathan Strange's real name, and that works. But it means that when Jonathan Strange goes and meets up with Mr Noral, who is his compatriot, ally, rival, friend, frenemy, all these things across the novel, it also falls on Norrell as well, because the laws of magic don't know which one the fairy meant. So it affects both of them. So I think that must have been in her mind, that the specificity of, you know, it matters to Norrell and to Strange that they are the Shropshire and the, what was the other one?
The Yorkshire
magicians, but it only matters to the gentleman with the thistledown hair that they are the English magicians, because what he means by that is they're just not fairy, and what Jonathan means by I am the Shropshire magician is I'm not Mr Noral. And so it's all about, you know, in group out group, presenting someone as the other, but through this very English lens of basically where you're from, and your county is very important to your identity.
So not surprisingly, Clarke, she moved around a lot as a kid, but a lot of the places she lived were in the north of England. She lived in Bradford for a bit, and at the time when Susanna Clarke was living in Bradford, it was particularly grim, I think. And she talks about her memory of the pack of feral dogs that roamed the town, and they were led apparently by this huge white Alsatian. And she says, I suspect a little embroidery, but it's too good a story to want to check, that when this pack of dogs led by the white Alsatian was out and about, they would see it from school windows, and they get a school tannoy announcement saying,
"What, the wild dog is?
Don't go outside until
Oh
they've
my
gone."
God, really?
Yeah,
that's Bradford.
But it does. Bradford is in
we'll
the
get letters.
60s or 70s, to be clear. I mean, Britain in the 70s. I was here.
I've heard it was.
I was here for Britain in the 70s. I was quite young at the time, but I don't. It wasn't our most picturesque decade.
Well, without getting too political, we are working our best to get back there. So we'll see how that goes. But back to the wonderful fantasy realm where that isn't the case.
So the other thing you like in art and drama generally, and let's see if we cut this out afterwards, is you like men having emotions.
I do.
And this is the thing about Strange and Norrell, and Clarke has also said that it is the story of their friendship. And Strange is a much more likeable character than Norrell, intentionally.
He is, but Norrell is sympathetic.
He is, and they both have their virtues, and it is this story of them quarrelling and then unquarrelling and the complexities of that. And to bring it back to the magic side of things, it is apparent that they have styles and preferences and beliefs which come out in the way they practice their discipline, which I think is very intelligently and effectively illuminated. So that's one of the ways. I remember somebody saying about Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon that one of the reasons the fight scenes work so well is that they are they're character scenes. You know, people are trying to hit each other with swords, but it's actually an extension of the character development, the way that they fight. And I feel the same way about the way that Norrell and Strange execute their particular enchantments in the book.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest differences, you mentioned earlier that Clarke had said that she actually found she wanted to stay in and read and write, which I'm sure will resonate with a lot of people listening to this podcast and a lot of people who play our games. And we basically feel like that. But she is actually quite scathing of this in the character of Norrell, because this is really his raison d'etre. He really doesn't want to do anything. He sort of really, the book opens with him essentially silencing all of the practical magicians, as he calls them, with a sort of clever coup d'etat that I won't spoil for you, because he just wants to read about it and control it and think about it and turn it into this quite fusty, although very impressively scholarly endeavour. And then along comes Strange, Jonathan Strange, who is a younger man who clearly has quite natural talent in the way that I don't think Norrell is ever implied to have natural talent. He's very clever, but I think he's just worked very hard for a very long time, so he knows a fantastic amount of stuff. But Strange is implied to have this sort of internal proficiency for magic without really doing a lot of the legwork. So he ultimately becomes Norrell's pupil, but Strange is a sort of man of action, and he is explicitly a Byronic figure. I mean, he actually meets Lord Byron later on in the novel, but he is obviously a literary character in the style of the Byronic heroes. So he is quite attractive, although he's explicitly not sort of super handsome. He's just sort of wild and a bit of a rogue, and but he's basically nice and a gentleman. There's
a lovely line in The Ladies of Adieu where a briefly point of view character sees Jonathan Strange sitting on a couch going to the house he's visiting. She doesn't know who she is, and she looks at him and she thinks, he's not a handsome man exactly. His nose is too long for that, but he has the arrogant air around him that handsome men have.
It's exactly this thing, right? So he does develop this slight following from the female characters in the novel. But his big character point, contrasted to Norrell's, is that he is essentially a man of action. He wants to use magic, he wants to do magic, and he'd much rather actually do magic than learn about it. And this is a point of tension early on in their relationship, because Norrell says, no, you're basically playing with powerful stuff. You've got to know what you're doing before you call down the rains or whatever it is. And Strange is ultimately like, okay, fair enough. So they study together. But Strange is constantly saying, I want to use it. And ultimately, one of their big rifts comes in the Napoleonic Wars, when the government, they are very impressed by Norrell, who has brought back English magic that has sort of trickled away over the centuries, but it used to be there, and they want to use magic to help them win the war. And Mr Noral is useless at this, because the government will come to him and say, have you got any good ideas about how we can totally destroy Napoleon? And Noral will say, well, I've read the 7th novel of the works of Mr Made-Up Man, and he suggests that in 1493, and they're like, no, this is not what we want basically a magic gun that shoots fire from the heavens and then the French will die. And Noral just isn't into that at all. Whereas Strange is kind of desperate to prove himself, and he's quite up for it because he's a young man. He's inspired by a national sense of let's beat the bally French, and off he goes. And then that's a counterpoint that's a character point for him as well, because we see his journey through the war. And he's really a fish out of water. He is more active than Norrell, and he isn't somebody who should be in a library all the time reading books and not practicing magic. But he's not a soldier. He's not a sort of action hero. So when he's in war, it's frightening, and he doesn't like it, and he wishes he was at home with his nice wife having a bit of claret. And he ultimately does become quite au fait with it, and it is kind of the making of him. He comes back a much more confident man than he left. But yeah, we've got that deliberate juxtaposition between the two.
I was reading the other day, I think I mentioned that Christopher Lee volunteered to fight with the Finns in the Winter War against the Russians, along with some other British volunteers. And
Does he have any connection at all with Finland?
I don't think so. I think it was a bit like the Spanish Civil War.
I was going to say Orwell, yeah.
But basically, the Finns didn't know what to do with these enthusiastic Brits.
These
they kept
beautiful actors.
They kept. Well, it was before he was an actor.
Oh, was when he was really young.
And so they kept them away from the front lines for 2 weeks, and they sent them home. And he said after he was quite glad they'd done that, because he wouldn't have lasted 2 minutes. He would actually.
Yeah, I think real war was probably a bit much for most people.
This is one of the to glance briefly on magic in books and magic in games.
Which is what we really should be talking about.
Well, no, we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about, and occasionally the cat will interrupt us and talk about what he wants to talk about. He's asleep now, fortunately.
We always have to do this podcast in the morning, in a brief, glorious moment between when the cat wakes up and is cross, and then when the cat gets hungry and is cross. So we're in a good window right now.
Yeah, well, he is twitching. Okay. There's a couple of tropes about magic that we've touched on there. One is the tension between theoretical and practical magic, or magical study and magical effects. So most conceptions of magicians, and especially most interesting conceptions of magicians, have it be part ability and part scholarship. And often you get different sort of combinations of the two. You get young Turks who are very talented but don't know how to deal with their talent, and they have to be taught to deal with it. And you get old wise people who don't actually do much. Possibly they could if they wanted to, or possibly they just know things but don't do things. So you get this tension. And in a game, of course, if you're going out and doing things, it's hard to make the studying, theorising part of it part of the game. Now, of course, in Cultist Simulator and Book of Hours, because I was interested in, you do specifically do that. And I think last week I talked about Ars Magica, the TTRPG, which was one of the Disney inspirations, and which made a virtue of doing exactly that. That's very hard to do in a traditional magic system in a game. The other thing that's very hard to do is the trope of messing with forces you do not understand at a plot level. I've said before that in games, story is a thing that tends to happen once, and mechanics are things that tend to happen many times. That's a really fundamental difference. And it's hard to have somebody messing with things that they shouldn't be before they're ready for it, and it actually having a significant effect more than once or maybe twice. Sure, you can have critical fumbles and the spell can literally blow up and do you damage. Sure, you can have a character development point early on where you take a different path or something. But by definition, if the magic is being used, in most magic in games most often is used for combat, although you get crafting in a lot of games, and then sort of less violent uses for it in some games. But if you keep on messing, and that you keep on having bad effects, and you keep on being able to function in the game, then either you're a clown or you very quickly cease to give a damn. So this almost always becomes a story point rather than a mechanic point, which I think is fundamental unless you build a system that's intended to allow people to poke at the edges and regret it. I would have liked to have done more of that in Cultist, really. There are lots of opportunities where you could experiment with things in Cultist and regret it, but it's usually just because you run out of funds. There's not much of we really shouldn't have used Winter instead of Forge.
What, in Book of Hours?
In Cultist.
Yeah.
Book of Hours, there's almost none of it because it's quite hard for things to go that wrong. But it is difficult to do. You can only put so much in a game.
Why? So why didn't you? Because you were just interested in putting other things in.
Because he made the whole game in less than a year, and there are only so many things I could have put in, and because the the system of combining aspects to get effects with the rights. Again, I would have loved to done more of. You largely use it for summoning, and then there's some flavour stuff. But it took me several. It feels like several months. In hindsight, I think it was only several weeks of development to get how the rights and the aspects and things work. Even then, I'd have done the rights differently now, because famously there's one or two rights that are actually much more useful than the others. But live and learn. Maybe in game 3,
which we know about, but we're not going to tell anyone about.
Yeah, we decided what it is, but we can't
It's
talk about it yet.
in our heads. We think you'll be pleased though, if you care about our games at all.
A small number of people will be enraged, but a small
Don't
number
say
will be
that.
enraged. Yeah, but the people that everyone else doesn't like. Anyway.
So, anything else you want to say, particularly about Strange or Grace Adieu?
I
haven't even mentioned Piranesi.
But I can't read any of my notes. Elderly man, I've written. This is the segue into the creative writing thing. Apparently, when Clark was getting started, somebody, presumably Greenland, one of his contacts, passed her work to an agent, and he sent her back feedback saying, if I didn't know who you were, I'd have assumed quite an elderly man had written this book.
I know what they mean. I know, but yeah.
Do you want to tell the romantic story?
So his name is Colin Greene.
Land.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said, I think she took a longer time than you might expect to consider creative writing seriously. I think she was a teacher of English abroad for several years, and then she, as we said, she became an editor of cookbooks and publishing, and she was clearly always interested in creative writing, but it took her a while to decide she wanted to pursue it professionally. So one of her first steps towards this goal, and bearing in mind she'd been writing what turned out to be Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral in private in quite sort of bitty pieces that she then stitched together to make the final piece, she decided to go to a creative writing course to skill up and see what it was like. And it was there that she met one of the two course directors or teachers, one of whom was Colin Greene, who was very impressed because as part of this course they had to bring a piece of creative writing that they'd already written, and she sort of presented a disjointed set of notes from Strange and Norrell, and said, I haven't been able to put them all together yet, so it's not a coherent story, but here's a sort of example. And he was so impressed by this that, similar to what the story you've just told, he passed it on to a friend who was connected to Neil Gaiman in some way, so passed it on to Neil Gaiman. I
think he passed it on directly to Neil Gaiman, who is described as a friend of the couple.
And then, after the fact, Neil Gaiman passed it on to either his publisher or someone else that he knew in literary circles. And the first that Susanna Clarke knew about this was she got a phone call from the fourth person, the agent, who phoned her up and said, have you got anybody to publish this? And she was like, I'm sorry, who are you? What? Hello? And all of this chain had been going on without her knowledge. But the thing that's really lovely about it, and I'm a total sucker for this, so I hope you are too, especially at Christmas time, is Colin Greenland, whose name I can't remember. I don't know, maybe there's a curse on us about these names. Colin Greenland and her became quite close over this creative writing course and ultimately fell in love. And they married. And they're this wonderful love story where he was incredibly supportive of her and really is the reason that she is known and is a published author, because he encouraged her and said, you really are good enough, you've really got something special here, go for it, which he clearly does. And yeah, they seem to be happily married ever since. We love that. We love a creative romantic partnership.
We do. I read him saying that he was conscious of his attraction to her sort of during the course, and he did his damnedest not to play favourites or of course say anything until he got to the end of the course.
Especially if she was actually probably one of the most talented in the course as well.
He said she was clearly the best writer on the course, but yes, and they sort of got to talk in the pub afterwards, I believe.
Yeah.
But
that's the way it happens.
It is the way it happens. I met Colin Greenland long ago. I was, I think, a very callow 20-year-old, and I went when I was that age to a couple of science fiction conventions in the UK with my landlord and friend at university, and he was the guest of honour at one of the cons. And I remember, to my mild embarrassment, I saw that there was a caricature of him on the front of the con brochure, and he came over to talk to Ivan, my friend, who he I think knew slightly, And I literally went, ooh, and I held up the brochure next to his face, like, it's you. And anyways,
was it a flattering caricature, or was it like hideously ugly?
Not particularly. I mean, Colin Greene looks a bit like a sort of a wizard in an 80s children's show.
I don't think you'd hate that.
So it looked like that. But yeah, he was very nice and said some encouraging things, and I can't imagine remembers the conversation. And it must be hard for him sometimes being a talented writer who is so much less successful than his talented wife.
Which makes me admire him even more, right? Because he was clearly still encouraging her to do her absolute best and succeed, despite the fact he must have wanted it himself.
And part of us, I'll get back to the illness actually, but I was going to say he wrote. He's written a wide variety of books. He's quite well known as a reviewer as well.
I didn't know
that. He wrote a book called Harm's Way, which is a sort of Victorian planetary romance. One of the inspirations for the original iteration of Sun in the Sky, although I don't think much of it made it into Sun in the Skies, the version they ended up making after I left. And he wrote another very different series of sort of pulp romances, Take Back Plenty, and a couple of, I think, less good sequels. So they're both about plucky heroines in space, but one in this Victorian post-Verdian mode, and one in a much more sort of grimy, pulpy mode. Both really good, and a bunch of other stuff. Day Baker, Different Mountain, Now the Thin Ox. Look him up. He's a weird talent.
I swear there isn't a book that you haven't read. It's very
upsetting. There fucking are. I was telling you the other day. I
have to bleep that out. This goes out to America. They heckin' are.
Well, you can't say Happy Christmas then, can we?
No, that is American.
I thought they have to say Season's Greetings or Happy Holidays.
Yeah, well.
Well, we said it now. We've.
There's nothing that can be done with recorded audio to change anything that's
happened. I say
happened.
Scrooge the Fooch. I can't say Frig the Pig.
Okay, I deeply regret this horrible diversion.
When I was in my 30s, one day I was getting so frantic about, I'd die someday and I wouldn't have time to read all the books. I literally sat down with an actuarial table and I worked out how many books I'd be able to read before the end of my life. If I might have been depressed that day.
Can you believe that this is the mind behind Spreadsheet Simulator Book of Hours?
And anyway, so there was a target to hit, which I immediately missed, of course, but I got distracted.
But it's impossible, surely.
Of course it's impossible. But the point is, even if you spend all your waking hours reading books, there'll still be far more books.
I just want to point out how nerdy this response is, because I gave you what humans might consider a compliment, and you responded by denying it, mathematically proving that it would be impossible to deserve the compliment, and then looking uncomfortable when this is pointed out to you.
Well, humans, this is why we need replacing.
Humans.
But it wasn't until much later I thought, Jesus Christ, what a fucking doom if you... I'm sorry I keep doing it. I feel strongly about this. What's a doom if you actually read all the books in the world and ran out of books? How fortunate I am to live in a world where it's impossible even to run out of good books.
You see, this reminds me of something that really haunts me from my childhood. I had... He doesn't remember it now, which is a real sore spot for me, and he's not even listening to this podcast.
You're not talking
so
about
he
me,
won't
are you?
know. I'm not talking about you.
Yeah. This is my father,
whom I love and is delightful, but we had this whole thing where we watched all these sort of like seminal programs together. We watched like old footage, like, because I've got quite into old cinema, so we watched some really like early 1912 footage from a little known French series called Les Vampires, which is amazing. And we watched all the German expressionism films, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and anyway, we watched all these classic films, and he's totally forgotten we did all this. He's forgotten we'd done all this. So whatever, it was meaningful to me. But we watched a lot of Twilight Zone, which I love. Really, really love the Twilight Zone. We keep meaning to go back to it because I haven't watched it in ages, and it really just stands the test of time. It's just brilliant. And one of the episodes that we watched back when I was younger with my dad really stuck with me, and it's a very famous one about I think he's a bookkeeper or some sort of nerdy accountant or something. And the essential premise, he ends up trapped in a vault when a nuclear blast goes off and essentially destroys all of civilization as we know it, which he is initially quite happy about because he's clearly not a super lovely person, and he's also clearly a desperate introvert and sort of just wants to be left alone to read his books, and his people keep bothering him to do his job, and he's just like, oh, finally they've all gone away and I'm left alone with my lovely library of books. And in the final moment when he's just about to sort of glory in the idea that he's got nothing to do in the world but read, this glorious moment where, yes, finally I can just be left and read, he drops his glasses and they shatter, which means, of course, that he is essentially a thirsty man surrounded by salt water. And it's really, I don't know, it's a really good moment. It's just awful, and it's really haunted me since.
I've never seen the whole episode, but I saw the scene in some clip show years ago, and it stayed with me as well.
It's haunting. Yeah. Right, thanks, Dad.
Susanna Clark's illness.
Well, this is the thing, when you said earlier in this episode that you don't want to read too much biographical detail into people's fiction, I think, have you met an English lit student? We can do that whatever way we want. And yes, I understand that she suffers from chronic fatigue. And I thought this was quite interesting in relation to one of the characters in Stranger Norrell, which is the character called Lady Pole, who is under the influence of the gentleman with the thistledown hair. And the way that this manifests is in the world as we know it, in the reality of London and Mr Noral and the reader. She comes across as incredibly tired all the time, and in reality, in the fiction, we know this is because she is being spirited away every night to dance these eternal balls in the Land of Lost Hope, I think it's called, which is the fairy kingdom that the gentleman with the thistledown hair controls. So of course, when she comes back to London, she's exhausted, but this just comes across as a sort of tiredness and ennui that means she can't really enjoy anything. And I'm sure this is not a direct one-to-one with the experience of chronic fatigue. Maybe there's somebody listening to this podcast who has experienced chronic fatigue, and if so, I'm very sorry. I hope you feel better. And two, maybe I'm getting this totally wrong, but it seems like an interesting parallel that the author, who is clearly so interested in this very believable magic system, would draw upon an existing illness to illustrate the magic of fairy.
So I'm glad you mentioned this. A couple of things. I read when I was reading for the show, I read an interview with Clark, Greenland and Laura Miller in The New Yorker. Laura Miller, I think we mentioned before, she wrote something called The Magician's Book, which was her attempt to sort of explore why, as a literary critic who likes serious literature about serious things, she bloody loved Narnia. And she'd gone through the thing that many of us go through who are atheists, where she got cross when she realised that there was Christian propaganda being smuggled into her growing brain. So she wrote a really interesting sort of literary biography of C.S. Lewis coupled with her own experience growing up. And so I love that she interviewed these two, and apparently she'd met them before when she was writing the Narnia book. And apparently, first of all, Clark was quite ill in Bilbao when the idea for Stranger Norrell was first gestating,
really?
When she was teaching English there.
I knew it came from a dream she had.
So obviously there's not a long-term chronic fatigue thing, but there had been. And Miller actually raised this point of the parallel between Pole and her old illness, that she said, yes, people have said, I now have a very 19th century illness. Where I can't really get anything done. I have to take to my bed and it doesn't seem to have any sort of resolution. And it's almost like a character trait at this point. And is it because I wrote a 19th century book and I wrote about fairies, and maybe you have to be careful about fairies because it ain't like being depicted, and maybe this is what I'm... And she's joking, but she's obviously not 100% joking. And then so she spent 10 years writing Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral, and it really shows. I've talked before about this quality patina, which is like the patina is a texture you get on old furniture that's very hard to fake because it's effect being touched by lots of people over years, and you get a similar thing with work that's been gestating for a long time. I've talked about Deus Ex, probably my favourite video game of all time.
It really does have a patina. I was very impressed by it. We played it together. It was long after I started to be interested in games. It was, 20 years old now? Mm-hmm. So I was really expecting it to be unplayable, because I went back and played some of the really early Tomb Raider games, for example, and I bloody love Tomb Raider.
Before anyone picked it up, it's worth saying this was a mod called Deus Ex Revision, which makes some of the textures less hideous to modern eyes, but still it's an old game.
It's still clearly like, if you'd be like, this is an emulator level. Anyway, the patina really is apparent, that there's so much going on beneath the surface, and there's so much that they let you kind of connect the dots on, and there's clearly so much world building.
And what the backstory was that it was in development for a very long time. Not a very long time by modern video game standards, I have to say, but certainly at the time. It was years. And it went through several different iterations. At one point it was all going to be set in a single city block, and that city block does appear in the game. So there was a sense of more stories going on than actually surface. Anyway, so...
No, you've got to tell the fun fact about the voice. That's a legal
you
requirement.
Tell it. It's your fact, because you found it.
Okay, this is the best fact you're ever going to hear about Deus Ex. Okay, you ready? You ready, guys? Because this is the best fact. That the voice of the main character in Deus Ex, who's called...
JC.
JC. Have a think about that one. He has a very deep, very manly voice, and everything he says sounds like this, and it's kind of ridiculous, but also kind of cool. And it turns out that this was a QA guy who worked on the game, who just was speaking like this because he just had a natural, cool voice. And they were like, "Hey, QA guy, I want to be literally the voice of the coolest person." And he was like, "Okay." So there you go. It's just like a helpful tester from downstairs
with a great voice,
with a fantastic voice.
He won't be listening to this.
He won't be.
The illness. Patina, so 10 years, and then she huge success, and then there was another 16 years passed, during which at one point she emitted this book of short stories, which which I'd love to read more of. Simonelli I thought was a really fascinating
that's the one that's got particular
character.
plaudits.
Yeah,
it was. I think it won an award on its own right.
The Fairy Widower.
The Fairy Widower, yeah.
And there's obviously a sort of lot of thought gone into it, and there's obviously behind this material, but you know the fact that it exists on its own means it's a particular treasure, and I'm glad in some ways that it'll never be expanded, or never likely be expanded, because after 16 years, a lot of it she was ill for. She wrote this other novel, Piranesi, which is not Strange and Norrell. So two things. First of all, in theory, she's writing on a sequel to Strange and Norrell, but has been at this point about 20 years.
Well, say a second point, and then I'll come back on that.
So between being an editor, being chronically ill, and having to write a follow-up to one of the most successful fantasy novels of all time, especially after 20 years away, my most earnest best wishes, but I'd be surprised if it ever surfaces. And the other thing I was going to say is, God damn it, illness. You have to cut this out so I don't. So I seem.
We'll play some music. We'll play some inspiring classical music while we totally remember what
that was it. Piranesi, thank God. So Piranesi is set in an otherworldly house.
Mm-hmm.
And
capital H.
Capital H. I have been asked whether this was an inspiration on
it has lots of walls
on the Mansers, and it wasn't, because it came out 2 years after Culture Simulator, and the house is not very Mansers is not very like the house in Piranesi. But one of the inspirations for Piranesi, of course, was the fantastic, in the original sense of the word, prison paintings of the Italian artist Piranesi, these huge monumental labyrinthine architectures. And although that wasn't in my mind, I think it probably was in the mind of Catherine Unger, the artist we were working with at the time, who did some illustrations of the house, and those do, to my now informed eye, look quite a lot like Piranesi's Carceri paintings. So I suspect there's some overlap there. But Piranesi is about this. Massive spoilers. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
There is an individual who lives in the house on his own, sheltered from the world, but also imprisoned. And in hindsight, she said, it's a lot like the experience of being ill for a long period of time. Yeah,
that's so
she
sad.
and Greenland apparently sort of mostly living in this cottage in Derbyshire.
Yeah, she did move to Derbyshire. I read that.
And she spent a little time on the sofa with tea.
Because it's funny you talked about the 10-year thing, because without casting any shade, because she is a fantastic author too. Donna Tartt famously came out with her debut novel, which everyone thought was fantastic, and it is. Secret History, hilariously. Not Secret Histories, Secret History, which if you haven't read, I super urge you to read. It's just brilliant. And then she wrote her next novel over a period of 10 years, which was, I think, considered quite a disappointment to her fans. Now, that doesn't mean that the novel wasn't very good. It just means it wasn't the same as the first one. It didn't have the same sort of thing that people were hoping for. So I also didn't think it was as good as her first one. And I know the patina effect that you're talking about, and I don't think Donna Tartt's second novel had it, which is interesting to wonder why. But clearly Strange and Norrell did have that real level of layers upon layers upon layers that can only be built up over time. But this is one of the reasons that we have Piranesi now, because Norrell and Strange did so well that she, of course, wants to do a sequel, and lots of people are like, please give us more of this magical world. And the novel ends not on a downbeat note necessarily, but it certainly doesn't have a "and they all lived happily ever after" conclusive ending. There definitely is a sense that there is another bit of the story coming after that, as you say, we probably won't get, which is kind of lovely, but also like, no, make everyone happy at the end, or at least give us some sort of closure. But she was trying to write the sequel, and because she was not well, she was really struggling to do all the amazing amounts of research that she has to do to create that same patina effect, and particularly with all the, like we said at the start, the corpus of fabricated magical scholarship that underpins the story. She's essentially writing sort of multiple novels at once, but then she's only slightly referencing the second novel in the first, if you see what I mean. So that requires a hell of a lot of research and effort before she can even get onto the plotting and the rest of the whole writing a book thing that seems to be difficult enough on its own. And so she had this idea of actually going back to an original concept she'd come up with before Strange and Norrell, which is what we now know as Piranesi, because it has a simpler plot and it doesn't have the same stylistic pastiche or the footnotes. So it is a kind of standalone story, and there's only one major character. There's other characters too, of course, but the focus is on this individual who's mysteriously living in this kind of mysterious environment, and the central plot, and it's a much shorter book as well, is him figuring out what really is going on around him. And it's brilliant. I highly recommend it. And I think it's a really interesting counterpoint in terms of the magic of Strange and Norrell, because it has a lot of the same systems. You know, we said before that Jonathan Strange and Mr Noral have this whole parallel between England in the 19th century and the Land of Faerie, and they both exist at the same time, but they're both very different. And Faerie in particular is a sort of unknowable, mysterious, natural place that's fundamentally magic, and England is this kind of urban, built-up scholarly place that also has magic in it, but kind of only because Faerie leaks into it. And Piranesi's existence, the house, I would say, is very similar to Faerie. You know, the visuals are different because it's explicitly not very natural. It exists in sort of marble-lined corridors that seem to go on endlessly. So it's very stony, and it doesn't have the sort of wood thing that was very important for Faerie and Strange and Norrell. But we have the same idea of, like, maybe it's an alternate reality, or maybe it sits alongside something else, but it's clearly not the world as we know it, and over the course of the novel we understand why. But I think it's a really interesting look at a much simpler lens on the same magical system, so they do sort of complement each other.
Yeah, you're right, and you reminded me of something else that came from the Laura Miller interview, which is that one of the inspirations for Piranesi, for the house, was a place called Charn. Now, if I say that, does it ring a bells?
It makes me think of charnel houses.
Which I'm sure was the intention with the coinage, but the guy who wrote of it was an English Don. It was Lewis. So yes, not Morse's assistant. And so Lewis and Tolkien, both, you know, Oxford Dons, both influences on Clarke, obviously. In The Magician's Nephew, chronologically first, although written later, Narnia book, our protagonists end up passing through the wood between the worlds.
That's the phrase, the wood between the worlds. Into
an abandoned city. It's a great, monumental, cruel place under a dying sun, from which everyone has passed, and they end up awakening something unfortunate there.
A very Lovecraft of them.
And she's a pretty lady though. And
not Lovecraft.
So there was this dream-like lead up to it where they're walking through all these abandoned monumental boulevards. And she said she was much taken with that. She said, I think I liked Charn more than C.S. Lewis did, because he didn't do much with it. And that was one of the thoughts behind Piranesi. So again, we come back to this basic desire of the writer to be left the hell alone and to be in a city where everyone's gone and Piranesi, although the protagonist doesn't have an entirely untroubled time, in some respects is a fantasy of solitude.
And it has, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but at the ending, the protagonist of Piranesi reconciles their experience with a new experience in a fundamentally positive way, which, if you read it thinking of Clark and her illness, I think is actually a very positive take. But if you have no idea what Piranesi is about, that is a totally inscrutable comment. But come back to this when you've read it, and you'll be like, yeah.
I want to say one more thing about the old magic system, which is just that one of the things that comes up in The Fairy Widower is this really clever use of rules as Mametian gags, as this something that is set up as a rule or as an expectation in the particular context of magic, and has a payoff later that works beautifully. So I can't talk about this without spoilers. So spoiler in 3, 2, 1.
Whoop, whoop.
The Simonelli as adversary is a fairy lord who we observe in an early chapter making a peculiar sign over the head of an old man who he does a disagreement with. And later it transpires the old man is found in a country lane, bisected, cut in two, dead. And because Simonelli is a scholar, when he sees him make the curious sign, he's, oh, I wonder what that is. So he writes it down in his journal for later examination. We don't have any idea it's lethal or anything at the time. So later, when he's confronted by the fairy lord, he has kept his journal handy because he's put 2 and 2 together by this point, and he makes this sign over the head of John Hollyshoes the fairy, who immediately realises what's coming and looks stricken. Unless you're smarter than me, you haven't realised either what the sign does at this point, because it's quite nicely red herringed. And then again, he is bisected and he wins. And the other example is one of the fairy traditions, one of the folkloric traditions that Clark's brought into Strange and Norrell, is that a lot of her fairies live in decaying palaces in squalor, but they use glamour to make it seem beautiful. So Simonelli, it turns out, is half fairy himself, which accounts for some of his nature. And when the fairy lord invites Simonelli to his household, he's surprised to see that Simonelli can see the, air quotes, 1 or 2 little specks of dirt about the place. And he's not impressed by his servants. Just saying, your eyesight must be very keen. And then he realises that's why they actually share a family. And so we've established that fairies live among glamour, so it looks glorious when it's not. We've established that Simonelli has an ability to pierce the glamour because of his fairy heritage. And then we have this poor girl, Dido, who's been seized and taken to the fairy stronghold to be a wet nurse to the fairy child. But because she's all glamoured up, she thinks it's great. She thinks she's in a beautiful blue velvet dress with a lovely child in her arms, sitting on a golden throne, being fed milk and honey, rather than being chained to this wooden chair, wearing the clothes that she'd been kidnapped in, suckling this horrible goblin. And Simonelli sees her, wants to rescue her, can't, but he does. The child's like being sick on her head.
Ew.
So she's got like a blood-caked eye, so he just moistens his finger and he uses it to wipe away the blood and the puke from the corner of her eye in a moment of kindness, which then pays off because, again in folkloric mode, the fact that he's moistened his finger with his own saliva and then touched her eye enables her to see the real nature of things through that eye. So then she wants to be
really
released
nice.
when he comes back. And again, this is all set up. So when you look back on it, it looks all of a piece. And it's the setting things up so they look all of a piece that really work. If he'd said, and now I looked in my book and I found a potion that you could give somebody to free, it would be fine, it'd be okay, but it'd be clearly just a device. You wouldn't feel like an organic part of it. And it wouldn't, because she's such a literary and layered author, tie into this commentary on whether Simonelli is English or Italian or fairy, and the fact that he's someone in Cambridge who doesn't fit in and gets sent to be a curate in this remote village where he's got no living. So it is all of a piece, and I think that's one of the reasons why
it's so satisfying.
She's so satisfying. She is such a fine writer. Every paragraph has something that gleams in it. We talk about the success of it. That's part of it. You know, she switched between funny and frightening very easily, and it does feel all of a piece. You can tell stuff is intended. Notoriously, Jonathan Strange doesn't even turn up in the book that bears his name for the first 200 pages.
Yeah, you do have to wait for Jonathan Strange.
But when he does, that feels all of a piece as well.
No, the way you've described it in that short story is exactly the way that the plot ultimately unfolds in Strange and Norrell, which I will not remotely spoil. But there will be a lot of things that are dropped into the plot that you will think you know where they're going, and either they go somewhere different because she's clever, or you forget about them because you're 600 pages in and it's not been mentioned, and then, oh yes, did we mention we did actually 600 pages ago, and this is now relevant, but in a sort of attractive kind of Christie way, that she's given you all the information to figure out who the murderer is, but she hasn't done it in such a clangy way that you're like, it's obviously him. So no, it turns out Susanna Clarke, really successful author, knows what she's doing.
Who knew?
Thumbs up to her magic system. All right, well, with that, I hope you go and read it if you haven't already. But we will wish you
a spooky day.